Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Extranet User Manager Office 365 Site Provisioning Automation webinar. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be your presenter for about the next hour or so. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. My contact information is on the slide. We're going to be recording the session and posting it up afterwards, so you have all my contact details through there. Let's start with a quick background introduction on Extranet User Manager. We're actually not going to talk about the product at all today. We're going to focus specifically on site provisioning, but I did want to give you a quick sense because we're going to do a follow-on webinar following this one next month. Background on Extranet User Manager, it started about 10 years ago as a custom extranet solution that we built for a number of clients, turned into a formal product about 5-6 years ago, and we added Office 365 support for it in the past sort of 2-3 years now. Put in Azure B2B support and launched out our channel partner program last year. So we've got clients globally around the world, primarily here in North America, Canada, where we're based, in the US, but also clients in Australia, Europe, Asia, scattered around the world. So that's it for the company background side. I don't want to take any more time on that side. What I want to do now is talk more about SharePoint Online and our topic for today around site provisioning. So I'm assuming most folks are probably familiar with SharePoint Online, but I want to do a quick little background. It is an application platform that's part of the Office 365 suite. It's very useful from a communication and collaboration point of view, very common in organizations all around the world as corporate intranets. It can be also used for team sites, which is going to be our primary focus here today, and also forms and workflows, and we're going to be leveraging some of that as well. Like this next slide, it actually came from SharePoint or Microsoft Ignite that ran last September. I'm really talking about the 3 types of places to work from a SharePoint point of view. We've got the personal, team, and communication sites. Personal files you'd know of as OneDrive for Business, and it's really a spot that's private by default. You can share files from there, but as you get into broader sharing, really team sites are the better place to do that. And that's where you share content with your group, as opposed to communication sites, which are really about publishing information and informing and engaging a broader audience, where you have a small number of publishers and a large number of consumers. We're going to focus in on the center one, SharePoint team sites, and go a little deeper on that side. So by default in SharePoint team site, all members are content authors. Now you have control over the permissions in the SharePoint team site. You don't need to have everybody be content authors. They could be readers, they could be designers. There's different permission levels that can be assigned in there. And it doesn't need to be just assigned at the site level. It can be assigned at the library, folder, or even item level within there. Some examples are department collaboration sites, committee sites, project collaboration, and those are all really examples of things that we're going to talk about today. Now, it doesn't need to be just people within your organization. We're not going to get into the external sharing today. I'm going to save that for next month's webinar, but you can share this externally with your clients, your vendors, your partners. And there's a lot of good work that Microsoft's done out of the box as part of that, and then we extend that with our Extranet User Manager product. It is very collaboration focused. It's really a working place. It's a spot to come together, work on your projects, work on your documents, communicate and collaborate. Now, SharePoint team sites are part of a broader toolkit for teamwork that makes up Outlook, SharePoint Yammer, Office apps, Teams. We're going to talk more about these in a minute. And they're all wrapped up in what are called Office 365 Groups. So before I get too far into that, I want to get a sense from the audience as to who's got which experience from an Office 365 point of view. So let me open up my first poll here. I'll just take a minute. So the first thing I want to understand is just how many people are using Office 365 versus the various different on-premise versions of SharePoint. You may have more than one. You might be in a hybrid where you're running, say, SharePoint Server 2013 as well as Office 365. So go ahead and apply choices to whichever are appropriate through there. And what I'll do, I'll leave that open for a minute, and then I'll share the results back so everybody in the audience can get a sense of, as a collective group, what's the current experience. Okay, pretty much everybody's voted there. I'm just going to close that out, and then I'll share that back. So not surprisingly, about 3/4 already on Office 365, likely why you're here today. Lots of folks, though, on the on-premise versions, whether that's SharePoint Server 2016, 2013, 2010, even back into 2007. So lots of different flavors and versions through there. Hopefully everybody gets a lot of benefit out from that. There's a second poll I want to do right now, though, so let me just hide that and pull this up. What I'm curious about here is how do you use Office 365 Groups today? And for some people, it may be that you just don't use them yet, but do you use them from a SharePoint Online point of view? Do you leverage Outlook or Teams as part of that? Maybe you're starting to use Planner. Again, just trying to get a sense of what people's current experience is with that. And again, I'll leave that open for a bit. Just let people respond to that. All right, so let me close that out and share that again. So about 2/3 not using Office 365 Groups yet. So that gives me some context. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the next couple of slides talking about Office 365 Groups and what those are. SharePoint and Teams actually being the predominant one. So that's higher than Outlook. So that's nice to see. Email is primary communication vehicle for a lot of people still today, but Teams is really starting to take off from that point of view. A couple of folks on the Planner side. Again, an interesting part of the suite that we're going to talk about as well. All right. So let's start just by talking about project sites. Forget Office 365 and groups and things for a minute. Just what you need from a project site. And this is actually a wish list that I put together back in 2015 when I was thinking about what's the best way for people to collaborate from a project point of view. And this was kind of pre-fully fleshed out Office 365 Groups. We had some of the early rumblings about it. And at that time, I was saying, exchange from an email and a calendar point of view is really important because everybody at that point communicates very heavily through email, and having a shared calendar is very important from that perspective. I'm a huge fan of OneNote, so making sure that OneNote is in there from an ad hoc note-taking point of view. For those of you who aren't familiar with OneNote, it's a great electronic notebook. It's actually free, so you don't need an Office desktop client to use it. There's free downloads available for your Windows PC, as well as for iOS and Android devices. And when you keep those notes up in a SharePoint site or a OneDrive for business or even a personal OneDrive, those are shared across all your devices. So it's really nice. You can be moving between devices, between your desktop, your laptop, your mobile phone, and have the same notes across all of those. I'm a big fan, I've been working with SharePoint since 2001, of having full SharePoint document libraries. When we first saw Office 365 Groups come out, they kind of had a OneDrive for business type of experience where you could have files associated, but you didn't get the ability to extend the metadata, create your own custom lists and libraries and things. They've now added that in as part of the Office 365 Group, so happy to see that happen. Because the ability to have custom lists in there, whether you want to track tasks or issues, risks, decisions, things like that, are important to that overall project management site. Sharing it with external users, being able to bring in people, because typically, many projects involve not just people within your organization, but people outside of as well. So how do we make it easy to share rather than doing email attachments, which is kind of people's default way of sharing documents with people external to their organization. And then there may be other external systems, financial systems, time tracking, bug tracking, things like that, a line of business systems within your organization that you want to be able to tie in as part of that. So let's swing back now a bit more to Office 365 Groups. And this is an infographic I grabbed from Matt Wade. He's got a great article up called The Everyday Guide to Office 365 Groups. So if you want to go deeper into Office 365 Groups, I strongly encourage you to have a look at that article. It looks a little overwhelming at first glance here, but it's done a nice job of kind of tying together all the different components of what makes up an Office 365 group. And at the top, one of the decisions you make when you create a group is where am I going to create that group from? And depending on which tool you use to choose that, you're going to have a slightly different group coming out of that. I can start in Yammer, which is Microsoft's enterprise social tool, and create a group there. I'll get a Yammer feed. I'll get the SharePoint site and Planner and OneNote, all those things as part of that. I'm not going to get the shared inbox and calendar from an Outlook point of view. I'm not going to get the shared Teams. If I create it from within Mail or Planner or SharePoint, I'm not going to get the Yammer feed as part of that, but I am going to get the shared Outlook email and calendar. If I create it from within Teams, I kind of get everything except Yammer, including the Teams wiki and the Teams chat. So you can see, depending on your choice, you're going to get slightly different experiences through there. Now, that's not to say once you've done it one way, you can't bring the other tools in as part of that. You could bring a Yammer feed into a group that you've created as part of your mail, your Teams, or likewise, if you created it through SharePoint and you want to add Teams to an existing Office 365 group, that is something that you can do. Also coming from Microsoft is the ability to what they call groupify existing SharePoint sites. So if you've got modern team sites, even classic team sites that have been created previous to Office 365 Groups, and you want to leverage that full feature set, it's not available from Microsoft just yet. They showed it at Ignite in the fall. They're still bringing it out, that ability to take that existing site collection and add the group elements to that. And just to give you a sense of what this is all about, the idea is that you've got a suite of tools from Office 365, and under that Office 365 group umbrella, it's really pulling it all together from one project, one department, whatever the scenario is. So let's say we're working on a cross-functional project. I create that group, say through Microsoft Teams on the right-hand side. It's going to create a SharePoint site for that group. So all the files that I need to manage, the documents that I'm working on, will live in that SharePoint site. We can use the OneNote notebook that's actually created as part of that SharePoint site as a common place to keep all of our notes. The way we do that at Envision IT is every client that we work with, we actually create a site for. In the past, it was a classic team site in SharePoint. We're now moving that to Office 365 Groups. But we all use OneNote. We have a common OneNote for each client, for each project that we work on, that has all the notes from everybody involved on that. So it's a great resource to be able to keep track of all that information. Now we may want to communicate through email. Office 365 actually gives us the ability to have a shared inbox for the group itself. So you can actually CC the group and have emails go to that inbox. Likewise, you have a shared calendar, so you can actually invite your project to calendar invites through Outlook. The nice thing there is maybe not all of the project team members are in that particular appointment, but they can look at that shared calendar and they can see all activities happening around that, that particular project. You know, and if you've used the linkages between Outlook and OneNote, when you keep your notes from your meetings, they actually go in the OneNote. People can see those notes as part of that there as well. Likewise, if we want to do a more modern style, Slack style team chat, we would use Microsoft Teams to do that. So lots of choices from Microsoft. That's often both their benefit and their hindrance, is that they give you all these options. Organizationally, you need to figure out which makes sense for you. Are we going to use email to communicate as a project? Are we going to use Teams? Really, you need to decide that on a project by project basis. Make sure everybody's using the same tool, or there's going to be miscommunications as part of that. So that's a bit of a background of an Office 365 group. Let's talk more about the topic for today, which is how do we create these? Now you can set up self-service. So let me actually do a little bit of live demo here. Let me flip over to my Chrome window. Which one are we in here? So let me come up to my parent level site. I'm using one of our dev tenants for demonstration purposes here. Apparently it timed me out here. We'll just wait for it to log back in again. There we go. So if I come to the waffle up in the corner here, or as it's also known as the app launcher, and go to the SharePoint app, this is really the place where, out of the box, I would provision new Office 365 groups in SharePoint. I can do it through Outlook, I can do it through Teams. Like we saw in that previous slide, there's a number of ways that we can do that. So if I come in here and I say create site, this is the self-service site creation. And when I create a team site through this modern experience, you can see down at the bottom here, it's going to create a site connected to an Office 365 group. So it's going to provision all that for me through there. Now that's a wonderful thing, but you might not want to let that wide open for everybody to be able to use. You know, the challenge there is that you got 3 different project members of the same project. They all create their own independent project site, and suddenly you've got, you know, site sprawl going on and all these orphan sites happening through there. So most organizations don't want everybody in the organization to be able to ad hoc create sites through there. They want some sort of controls and governance around that process. And that's really what we're going to talk about here today, is the ability to put some controls around that through a site provisioning process. This is something we've been working on for some time. We actually have a case study from last summer for work we did with associated engineering around that. It was kind of the genesis for what we built out here, but we've taken it quite a bit further from there. We've actually open sourced it out and made it available. I'll provide all the links as part of the deck, so you can actually pull down the bits related to that. So let me start with the requirements. What were we looking for from a solution requirements point of view? Well, we want some sort of self-service. So there's a form that end users can fill out to say, hey, I need a new site. Maybe there needs to be approvals there. What does the workflow look like around that? It's going to be unique for every organization. They're going to have their own templates, their own style of doing things, their own approval processes. So it's got to be something that's easily extensible and customizable so that each organization can make it unique for their particular requirements. Now we want to leverage out of the box as well as customized site templates. When I went through the create site a second ago, that was showing the modern team site, which is an out of the box template. But maybe you've got a specific SharePoint site template that you want to use for your organization. You've got particular libraries, particular content types, site columns, views, and such that you want as part of that. Let's make sure that we account for that as well. Obviously, we want to support modern sites, both communication and team sites, and Office 365 Groups. That's the direction that everybody's going in. And a key one at the end here is that we didn't want to use Visual Studio as part of the solution. We didn't want people to have to get into C# code and compile things. That scares a lot of IT pros off. We wanted to make sure it was all around PowerShell and standard tooling so that IT pros can get their head around it, maintain it, support it, extend it, and do what they need to do from that point of view. So from a technology point of view, we're leveraging a number of different products from the Microsoft stack, primarily within Office 365, but also in Azure. So on the left-hand side, we start with SharePoint. We're going to talk more about this. We actually have a list in SharePoint that drives this whole process. So it's where new requests go in, where approvals happen, and it kind of manages that whole process through. We've got a Power Apps form that we'll show you that makes it a little cleaner and simpler for people to add new requests into that list. We've got a flow that does the workflow. It could do the approvals. It kicks off the creation of the site. It can email notify people to let them know things are done. And under the hood, as I mentioned, PowerShell being a tool that a lot of IT pros are familiar with these days, keeping it simple from a code development point of view. On the right-hand side, Azure and Office 365 working together, Key Vault for security, kind of wiring all those pieces together. So as I mentioned, we'll put this deck up on the site so you have access to all these links. This is where you can find all the project documentation. So the source code is available today. It's up on my GitHub site at github.com/petercarson/eum-sites. So you can download that from there. We're in the process of putting together a series of articles on the whole step-by-step of how to do this and actually pulling that into an ebook. So I'm going to take you through that document. We're going to send a draft out to everybody so you can have a chance to get an early look at that. Try it out if you like. If you've got questions and feedback, that would be wonderful. Love to hear that back. I mentioned we started this work last summer. We've got a couple of case studies on the work we did with associated engineering, both up on the Extranet User Manager and the Envision IT sites. They're actually two different case studies. One is more focused around the external collaboration on the Extranet User Manager side. The other is more focused around the site provisioning that we're talking about today on the Envision IT site. Okay, so let's have a look at, technically, what does this look like? What does the solution overview of this entail? So as I mentioned, there's a SharePoint list. It's used not just to handle new site requests, it actually tracks all the existing sites. We have some interesting features we're going to hold for next month's webinar, potentially about how we can use that and leverage that to make it easier to navigate to your sites. So you can enter those site requests right into the list itself, or we could have a Power Apps or some other form used as a front end for that. I'll actually show you the different scenarios, give you a sense of what the user experience feels like through those. There's a Microsoft flow that kicks off when a new request is added. You might want to have an approval workflow as part of that, and then we use Azure Function Apps to wrap that and host the PowerShell that's really going to glue all this together and do the heavy lifting. So let's start with a solution demo, and then we'll go into a technical walkthrough from there. So if we start from an end user's point of view, let's come back to this site here, and we say, okay, we're not going to create a site through this here. Let me just come back to my main site where I have the list, and let's have a look at what's in there. So So as I mentioned, we've got a list in SharePoint, and actually I need to switch back to Classic for a minute here. Some features are not available in Modern just yet. I want to have a look at the setup of the list itself. So it's got a whole bunch of columns defined in here that you use to request a new site, but it's also used to track the creation of the site, branding deployments, which we're not going to use today, Extranet User Manager groups for external access. Again, we're not going to touch on those today, but it's kind of future-proofed, and it's got a fair bit of functionality in there. So if I come back to the list itself, I can go through the classic interface here and actually add in a new item. Oh, actually, it's taking me back to there. Let me go to Classic. Oh, it keeps switching me to Modern. Okay. I should probably explain what we're seeing here. I've actually put a Power Apps form in front of the list here. So even though there was, a dozen and a half different fields on that list, we've narrowed it down to the ones that are of interest through here to allow you to create a new item into the list, to say, hey, there's a new site that I want to create in here. This is one way of doing the customization. We've done it right through Power Apps in SharePoint itself. I can actually switch over to the Power Apps Windows application itself as well, and we've actually built a standalone app that does the same thing too. If I come into this Create a Site application, we've actually made it a little friendlier for end users to go through this experience here. So what it's doing now is bringing up a gallery page to say, hey, what type of site do you want to create? And we can see these are not just the out-of-the-box sites. I've got communication sites, team sites, but I also have an Envision IT client site and project site where we've actually put our own template information in as part of that. Last minute dry run through here, I had some issues there, so I'm actually going to use the team site and go through this process here. Actually, no, I want to do a modern communication site because that's a quicker one. It doesn't create as much infrastructure. Add a naming convention so I could keep track of all these sites. Let's see, I think I'm on number 4 there. Now I do have the ability to set a parent URL here. This is one of the things that we've done with our sites provisioning structure. Since all these sites, when you're using modern sites, get created as top-level site collections, there's not really a hierarchy of which sites belong to which. So we actually use the list to track that, to say, hey, we can set a parent for any particular site and start to build a deeper hierarchy. It's kind of like what Microsoft announced in the fall with their hub sites, where you can build a 2-level hierarchy, except this is multi-level. You can go as deep as you want. Hub sites aren't out yet, just yet now. We've got this available as part of the open source solution. I'm going to leave that blank for now and just go ahead and request a top-level site. So what this is doing is the app is actually writing to that SharePoint list that we were looking at. So let me come back to SharePoint for a minute, cancel out of here. I actually want to keep it in the modern experience. Let's stay there. Okay, so I can see right here, there's a new list item that just got added for that webinar Feb 27.4 site that I requested. Now it's still in process. It's actually creating that site right now. So the site created field isn't filled in yet. Let's actually have a look at what's happening behind the scenes as part of that. So I mentioned Microsoft Flow. Flow is the cloud-based workflow engine from Microsoft. It's not just about SharePoint. It can connect to a whole lot of Microsoft services, but external services as well. You could connect it up to Salesforce, to Dropbox, Twitter, do all sorts of interesting types of scenarios through here. I'm going to go into My Flows, though, and we'll see we've got a Create Site flow here. If I click on that, I can see the history and see, well, that actually just succeeded. It ran 54 seconds ago, ran for 43 seconds, and I can see what it did. Well, it basically watched to see that, hey, there was a new item created in a SharePoint list, and I needed to go call the Azure function called Create Sites to go create that site. So we'll come back to what actually happens under the hood in a minute. If I come back to my list and refresh that, I can see now that the site created is being filled in. Yeah, it's properly populated, and I can actually click into that site. And boom, there's my modern communication site that was created through that Power BI app. The Power BI app didn't actually create it, it just put an entry into a list, and then there was the workflow that happened behind the scenes to do the creation from there. One of the nice things with the modern sites is they did a lot of work in the engineering team at Microsoft to improve the speed at which modern sites got created. So this site takes about 5 seconds typically to get created, which is a lot faster. It was typically several minutes to get a classic team site created in the old style. So that's nice to see. Now the flow is pretty straightforward. If we look at what's happening in there, it's just looking for a new item and creating the site. So I haven't added in a workflow, I haven't added in any approval or notification emails. That's actually pretty easy to do. And I'll show you a bit more of editing that flow and what that looks like as part of that. Okay, so that's sort of a walkthrough of what the solution looks like. It's pretty simple from the end user's point of view. It's very extensible from the administrator's point of view, and provides the ability to do approvals as part of that as well. So let's switch gears and actually go a little deeper into the technical deep dive here. So what I want to do now is actually open up the document that I'm creating and just walk you through a few of the things that are in there. Oops, that didn't want to open. Hang on a second. Sorry, I forgot to have that open and ready for us here. Let me just navigate and get that open. Word is thinking. There we go. Okay. So it's a fairly extensive document. It takes you through the prerequisites you need to have in place first, how you get the project set up, and then walks you through the process of actually building that create sites solution through there. So let's start with the prerequisites. We're going to get a little technical here. Apologies for those of you that are not technical yourselves. This would be of interest to folks that actually want to implement this out, so other folks in your organization if it's not you. As I mentioned, one of our goals was to leverage PowerShell as a big part of this. So the scripts themselves are all written in PowerShell, which makes them very easy to edit, manipulate, and modify. So there's a few things you need to make sure you've got the right version of PowerShell, you've set your execution policy, and things are ready to go from there. We also leverage the Office 365 patterns and practices commandlets. These are open source components that Microsoft has released that the community contributes as well. Really makes it a lot easier to interact with SharePoint through PowerShell. So we leverage that as much as possible as well. Then there's a tool called Windows Credential Manager. It's an add-in for PowerShell to save credentials. One of my goals from a solution architecture point of view was to ensure that we didn't have credentials being stored in the scripts or in files anywhere. That's an obvious security flaw. We don't like to see that, so we actually leverage Windows Credential Manager to do that. So that uses the in-the-box features of the Windows operating system to securely store the credentials for us. In the case of when we run them up in Azure, we actually use Key Vault to do the same thing as well, and I'll talk more about that. Now you will need a billable Azure subscription. It can be your Office 365 Azure subscription, but it does need to be converted to a pay-as-you-go, so you actually pay for that, or it could be a developer subscription that you get as part of Visual Studio. Charges are going to be less than $1 a month. These are very minimal things. The Key Vault, I think, was 4 cents a month or something trivial like that. So these are not big charges that we're talking about. So in terms of getting the project up and going, I mentioned it's all located up in GitHub. So if you come to the GitHub site, let me just bring it over here. If you haven't gone to GitHub before, it's a great place to discover and collaborate on open source projects. So all the source related to it is here in the GitHub repository. You can pull the whole thing down as a zip file fairly easily right from there. You don't even need to create an account on GitHub if you don't want to, and away you go from there. So a couple of things that we need beyond pulling the bits down. There's a file called SharePoint.config where you actually define the environments that you're going to be using as you're testing. So rather than changing the scripts, we actually have this configuration file. You can have multiple environments like your development, your test, and your prod environments all defined in there and ready to go from there. Now we were showing you the SharePoint list where we were putting the site requests in. We need to create that list. You could create it by hand, but it's a little tedious to get all the columns in there, get everything set up properly. So one of the scripts that's up there actually goes through and creates that list for you. Excuse me. So you run this create list PowerShell script, and it will go through the process of creating all the site columns, the content type, the list, supplying the views, and wiring that all together. So you can point that at any site that you prefer to keep it in. We recommend that you have it as a standalone site, create the list, and then you're set to go. Now, one of the things I mentioned is that list isn't just used for new requests, but it's actually used as a catalog of all the sites in the system. So the second PowerShell script you run, called this update sites list, will go through and interrogate your tenant and discover all the sites, site collections and subsites both, and basically populate that list with all that. So if you've got your existing tenant, it's got a whole bunch of sites there already, you run this script on it, now your list is all populated with the existing ones there. So you can set parents, you can use it to manage and decide, and when we talk more about next month's controls around things like site navigation, they can leverage that list as part of that. Okay, so we've got the list there, we've got it populated with the current state. Now we get into the real work of working with the create sites solution itself. So as I mentioned previously, we've got the SharePoint list, the Power Apps form, the Flow workflow, the PowerShell scripts, the Azure functions, the Azure key vault. So a lot of different technologies to wire together, and there's a number of steps you need to follow to put that together. Now we could package this up a little simpler for you to deploy, but I actually like the idea of keeping it fairly well exposed so that people that are going to manage the system really understand how it all wires together and what all the moving pieces are. So the document basically runs you through that whole process. So the first thing is when we're building these scripts is, we want to be able to quickly debug them, work with them and such. So we actually work with local PowerShell copies of those scripts. So I can actually come back to my PowerShell integrated source environment where I can actually set breakpoints, walk through scripts, work with it from there. I can actually hit run on here, and it'll basically ask me which environment I want to run against. Let's say we want to run against the demo environment, number 3 here. It's gone into the Windows Credential Manager on my local machine because I've run it before here. Said here's the username I should be using, and look, there's no sites pending creation in that list. If I was to create a new entry, the flow would try and create it right away anyways, but if that flow wasn't there, this script would go through and run that process. The nice thing is this script is identical to the one that we're going to be running up in Azure. So it makes it very easy for me to walk through, get the script working just the way that I want, and then upload it into Azure and start working it with there. Because I have a little less control from a debugging point of view once I get it all integrated in together. If you're not familiar with PowerShell ISE, it's a standard component of PowerShell that gets installed to your local system. I strongly encourage you to use it from a development and debugging point of view. It's very easy to come in here, click on a particular line, hit F9, say I want to set a breakpoint there. When I hit F5 to run, now it stops. I can actually step into the other functions and actually walk through my code, see what's happening, interrogate values, change my code, do what I need to do from a testing point of view. So it makes life a lot easier as a PowerShell developer. Without getting too deep in the code itself, I want to give you a quick walkthrough of what it looks like. So it basically does some initial setup to get its environment all set. It looks to see if you're asking to create a specific item in the list or whether it should just query through the whole list and find anything. And basically it's building what they call a camel query here to say go find any entries in that list where that site created field is null, and that ID matches. Or in this case here, don't worry about the ID, just find any site that hasn't been created yet, go create it. And it basically spins through that collection of sites that came back from that query and starts the process of building those sites out. So there's a number of fields that it needs to capture from the list, and then it needs to decide what type of site is it going to create. Is it building a classic team site, a modern team site, modern communication, which is the one that we built, modern client site? So it sets a number of different variables depending on which style of site it's going to be creating. And then the actual creation of those sites depends on the type of site. If it's a classic site, there's certain PNP style commands that I use to create that site versus the modern sites have a slightly different commandlet and arguments to build that out. Once the site's been created, maybe there's a custom template that we want to apply in here, like our Envision IT client site template. It actually applies that template onto it. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but we have the ability to capture a site set up the way that we like and say, make that a template. Every time we create a new site, make it look like that site. which is really wonderful if you want to have standardized project site templates as part of that. It updates a few things of the list and then spins around and checks for the next site from there. So that, at a very high level, is really what the PowerShell scripts are doing. So the idea is, as an IT pro, I can extend this. I can put my own rules in, do my own things that are unique to my particular environment as part of customizing these scripts. And it's fairly easy for me to do that in PowerShell, test it out, and then deploy it up into Azure. So let's come back to our document. So we've got the PowerShell script. Now I mentioned from a credentials point of view, once we run them up in Azure, we're going to use something called Azure Key Vault to store the credentials. Because I don't have the ability to answer a question or type in a password when it's running in Azure, that all needs to run unattended. Azure Key Vault is a great spot to keep all that information. So let me come back over here into my Azure portal. If I look at all my resources, I'll see here I've got an EUM Sites Key Vault. I can go into that, and I can actually see secrets that I've put in here for my service account and password. I won't dive all the way in. I don't want to show the credentials, but basically if I have access into the Azure portal as an administrator, I can maintain those credentials. So they're not stored in my script. They don't get checked in at GitHub by accident and shared out with everybody. That's an obvious security concern from that point of view. So the document basically walks through how you create that key vault. And it's got a bunch of screenshots in here, and then populate the two secrets for the service account and the service account password in there. Now, once you've got that, you need to actually test that out. So we can actually put the tenant ID information into the SharePoint config file, run that same PowerShell script that I was showing you before. If I come back here for a second, let me go ahead and clear that breakpoint that we had and just rerun that. You can see here we've got it wired into the Azure Key Vault. We can actually use that choice and make sure that all that plumbing is working properly. So if I choose 4 through there, it wants to know who's going to connect to the Azure Key Vault because I haven't run it on this machine before. So I'm going to use that demo account, and it wants my credentials. It's actually going to store those credentials to get to the Key Vault. It sounds a little convoluted in my local credential manager so that we can get in and access the secrets that are in there. There's nothing pending creation, so nothing needed to happen, but it talked to Key Vault, it got what it needed to do, and we're ready to roll from there. Excuse me. Okay. Now the big part of it is we want this PowerShell to run up in Azure. The way we do that is we use what's called an Azure Function App. So let's come back over to the portal again for a minute here. And come back to my sites here. It'll take a second to populate. And we'll see the create site Azure function. For those of you who are familiar with APIs, basically what we're doing is creating an API method called create site that when you call it through an HTTP REST call, it actually executes that PowerShell and does the work for us. So this is a nice way to be able to connect the flow up with the PowerShell script. Now, a caveat to be aware of when I go to create a new function through here, I don't actually see PowerShell as a standard option here. I need to turn on this experimental language support. If I enable that, I now have the ability to create a PowerShell. So the caveats that go with that are that the language is experimental, doesn't have full support yet. So you actually have to go through GitHub to get support on it from that point of view. So bear that in mind. Is this ready for prime time? Well, the functionality has been in the Azure portal in experimental mode for over a year now. It's reasonably mature from that point of view. I'm not sure what the plans are from Microsoft about general availability and making this fully supported. I'm keen to see that happen because I think this is an awesome way to tie the PowerShell together with the flow from there. Now I've already got my method in there, so let me just close out of this one here and come back to the existing one that we've got. So if I look at my create site method that we've got here, so I actually see that same PowerShell. I've uploaded it through FTP, and I describe those steps in the document, and I can run that script right from within the Azure portal itself. So now it's not running on my local machine anymore. Microsoft is actually creating a virtual machine in the cloud and running my PowerShell on it. There's a couple tricks that we need to do to get that to work properly. I mentioned we use the Office Dev patterns and practices open source as part of that. So we need to upload all the modules related to that for that code to be able to run, because we can't install that on Microsoft's virtual machine. We don't know what VM that's going to be from instance to instance. It may move around. We don't really have control over that, nor do we want it, because we don't need to patch it. We don't need to manage it. Microsoft takes care of all that for us. In fact, we only pay for that VM on demand when we use it, which is what makes this so cost effective from a solution point of view. We're not paying a couple $100 a month to have a virtual machine out in Azure running all the time. We're literally paying dollars a month for the few times that we need to run this. And I can see at the bottom here, I've got my output from PowerShell. I can actually put debugging, write output commands in here if I want to debug my scripts. I can't set breakpoints like I do in the interactive debugger, so it's not as nice from that point of view. But I can still do some debugging as part of that through there. So that's sort of the first method, is just to make sure that that PowerShell runs in Azure, that I've set up all the settings appropriately. If we come back over here to my application settings, again, we don't have that SharePoint config file, but we do have the ability to set settings through the Azure portal, like what is the Office 365 tenant that we're going to be going to, and where is the list that we're going to be accessing, and details for the secrets and stuff from that point of view. Okay, so we've created the function app. We've created the function itself. We've gone through the experimental with PowerShell. We've set up the key vault credentials. There's a few things that we needed to do described in the document to give permissions to the app that we've created to read those secrets from the key vault. So we need to set those permissions up appropriately through there. You get all the files up there, set up the API definition. Again, it takes you step by step through here. I'm not going to take you into all the details as part of that. The configuration that we just saw through there, all the details that you need to fill in. And then we get to the point here that I just showed you, where I press the run button to make sure that the function actually runs up in Azure. Now there's a couple of ways that we can test it out. There's a Swagger definition for the function as well. Swagger is an open source tool for documenting your API. So I can come back over into here, look at my function. Actually, I need to remember which spot I'm in. API definition, yes. So if I come in here, this is my definition for Swagger. We include all the details of what you need to put in there. And I can actually authenticate and try the operation out right through that web interface. I pass in the list item ID of what site I want to create. I say go send the request, and it'll actually do the post and exercise the whole thing end to end. So one of the things I wanted to do in the recipe that I've created here for you to use is to make sure that you could check step by step as you're going through each point in here, and make sure that you understand that it's functioning properly, and if it's not, be able to debug and get that working at that point. Because if you get all the way to the end and it's not working, you're not going to be sure which of the many points along there has caused you to grieve. So it's important to take your time, work through each step in order there, test as you go, and make sure it's all hanging together. Now, the secret sauce of how we get the Azure function connected up to the flow is the next step here. So if I come back to my API definition screen that I'm in here, I've got this button called Export to Power Apps and Flow. And clicking on that actually brings up a window where I can define a custom connector that's going to show up in Flow. I've already done that, so I'm not going to create it again through here, but I give an API name. I tell it what to use for the key value that's going to provide the security between Flow and the API. So if you don't know that key name, you're not going to be able to call that Flow and then go ahead and export that out. So let's come back to Flow here. Let's start right at the top. If I come to my gear and look at my custom connectors, remember I've already done that export process. I have this create sites connector in here. So I can actually click on the pencil to edit it, and I can see all the details around it. What's the host? Well, it's actually being hosted up in Azure. I can look at the security, so the keys that are being used to authenticate, definition information, and I can actually do a test at this point here. I need to create a connection. So that code that we were talking about that provides the authentication, I need to know that code and paste it in here to create that connection so that I can then come back here, put in an ID value, and go ahead and test that operation to see how it works. So again, each step of the way, let's make sure everything's hanging together and working here. So now I've got my custom connector, I can actually use it in my flows. So I've already got an existing flow there, but let's actually go through the process of creating a new flow just to show you how easy it is to do that. So I'm going to create from blank, and I want it to trigger off when an item gets created in SharePoint. Because remember, when something gets created in that SharePoint list, I want to trigger the flow and start the process of creating the site. So I use that one there. I have to tell it, well, where is that SharePoint list that I want to watch? So if you remember, it's in that /site/landing site collection that I created, and it'll go in there and tell me, well, there's only one list in there called sites. That's the one I want. Okay, so now I've got my flow ready to trigger, excuse me, anytime an item gets created in this list. Well, what do we want to have happen next? Well, let's add a step to that. Yeah, we may want conditions if we're doing approvals, but let's keep it simple and say we would just want to add an action. So as I mentioned, there's connectors for all sorts of things. I can create emails and events and contacts and do things in SharePoint, but what I want to do is call my custom connector that I created. I can scan through this whole list to find it, or I can just type in the name of it, do a search, and there's my Create Sites custom connector that I created. Go ahead and click on it. So remember, that function that I created in Azure takes one parameter, which is what's the ID of the list item that you want me to create a site for. So it's expecting me to fill in an ID, but I want to type a number in here because it's going to be different every time this flow runs. So I click on here and I can actually connect it up to dynamic content to say, hey, I want to connect it to the list item ID because that's the item that I want to create the site for. Boom, that's really all I need to do. I just hit save flow, create it, and it's ready to run. I don't want to have two running on the same list. That's going to get confusing. They're going to conflict with each other. But let's look at some of the other things that we can do. We can add a new step in here, add another action. Let's say we want to send an email. So I can define the to, the subject, and the body, and those can all be dynamic as well. So on the to, I could say, well, I want to send it to the person that created the request, created by email. And say your site is ready, and I could actually send the site URL in the body of the email so they know what site we're creating. You know, I could also send an email to the administrator to say, hey, a new site has just gotten created through here. I could also add an approval step back in here to say, hey, I want to make sure that we get this properly approved before I go ahead and create the site. So you can get quite complex with the flows and how you want to structure that out. I'm going to abandon this one because I've already got my existing flow there, which is my create site. And we can see that it's just doing the very simple, if we edit that, when an item is created, go ahead and create it. And I can see all the history of each of the runs through there, and I can actually go into individual ones, excuse me, and see the details on those. You know, what was the list item ID, the status code that came back, 200 means successful from an HTTP API endpoint point of view, so that was all good. So all those details are there. I could resubmit it if I wanted to rerun it or edit the flow from there. So that's all described here in the flow workflow of how you create the custom connector, export that out, how you create the flow and use that. The piece that's still missing that I haven't filled in on the doc just yet is the actual Power Apps side of it. So I showed you two different flavors of that. Let's come back first to the SharePoint site. So if I come in here, all I did was I said, you know what, I want to customize the form for this particular list through Power Apps. Now this is still an early release feature, so it's not in all of our tenants. This dev tenant does have it because it's got first release turned on it. But when we do that, it jumps me over to Power Apps and says, okay, I'm going to allow you to modify that list form in Power Apps. Takes a minute to get itself initialized and ready to go. And we'll see here is our customized view of that. It doesn't have all the fields on there. We simplified it. By default, what it did was it put all the fields from the list in there, and then I simply removed the ones that I wasn't interested in having people fill in as part of a site request. This one I didn't fully flesh out. Depending on the site template that I pick, I actually want different fields like the URL versus the alias showing up, depending on the type of site that you're creating. You can build those rules in there to say hide or show different fields based on choices of other fields. You can get fairly sophisticated as to how that works. Once you're done, you can publish that and away you go. You can set up different screens, if you've got different formats for that. You can see this is designed as a mobile first. It actually works nicely on the desktop screen as well. It comes up on the right hand side, but if I was on a smartphone, it's all mobile friendly. It's going to work very well from a smartphone or tablet point of view as well. So that was one approach. The other was, let's not publish that, was to build a full standalone application. So if we come back to the full Power Apps client, so I can actually do this either through the app that I've installed locally, or I can do it all through the browser. Surprising thing is the browser actually gets a little quicker as things get more complex, but I wanted to show you both experiences through here. They're very similar. So it's now downloading that Create a Site app that I showed you previously in edit mode, so I can actually go through how that's configured. What we'll see when that comes up is there's a number of screens defined. So you remember when we first launched it, it had a gallery screen that came up that said, what type of site do you want to create? That's screen number one. And then that's wired into the different types of screens, whether it's a team or a communication style site that has slightly different things that you need to ask. That's managed through those independent screens. And then there's a success screen when it's all finished, just to let them know that, hey, we're all done. So there's a number of rules and advanced functions in here that capture things like which did I click on here and what parameters do I want to save from that, so I can use them later when I actually create the site through there. The other nice thing with the Power Apps is we should be able to wire this up that we don't give people permission directly to the list. The only way they can request a site is by coming to the app, and then it goes through a service account to access SharePoint that does have rights there, so that we can be sure that they're using the app and properly requesting sites and going through the proper process and flow from there. So I hope that gives you a sense of what that all looks like. Let me flip back to my PowerPoint deck now. So we've gone through the technical deep dive. As I mentioned, we're going to send a copy of that document as part of the follow-up, as well as links to the recording and the presentation that I'm going through here today. A couple of things I want to wrap up with just before we close things out. We didn't get too deep into Office 365 Groups themselves. As I mentioned, we're starting to use them more and more ourselves. They're a great way to manage projects. Keep all your documents in SharePoint, so you got a single version of the truth there. Conversations could be in email, they could be in Teams. You have choices from that point of view. Shared calendar is useful in both scenarios. OneNote, I strongly encourage you, if you don't use it already, check it out. It's free. It's available for anybody to use. Skype for Business is actually transitioning into Teams, so that's all coming together as well. Planner and Delve become part of that conversation as well. Now that's a lot of different things. You don't need to start with all of that. Just choose what makes sense for your organization. You can augment and add to that as time goes by. Now, do be prepared for change. I mean, Office 365 is changing very quickly. Change management and communications, both from Microsoft to you. So having somebody watching what's coming from Microsoft and then communicating that effectively out to the rest of your organization is really important. I mentioned before, you need to decide which conversation formats make sense for your teams. You're going to standardize on sticking with email and Outlook. Are you a Yammer shop and maybe Yammer makes sense? Are you going to use Teams from a persistent chat or Slack style way of communicating? Choose one of those for the project. Don't use multiple methods. It's going to get confusing for people, and people are going to miss communications. Make sure you got your governance in place. Things like the site provisioning is a big part of that. What is your external user policy? We're going to talk more about that in next month's session, about how do I invite people in from outside my organization into these sites. and figure out your information architecture and your site templates. I mentioned we have the ability to snapshot a site, capture it, and then create additional sites off of that template. So understand what that looks like. One of the nice things with the templating in the patterns and practices from Microsoft is that you can apply templates to new sites that you can create, but you can also apply it to existing ones. So if you change your mind about what a project site should look like and there's some new feature you want to put on all of them, you can actually go back and apply a new template to those existing sites. It won't remove anything that's been removed from the template, but it will add anything that new from that point of view. And I'm a strong proponent of building a provisioning process. Use what we shared out here. It's all available there in GitHub. The documentation is all there. If you need help, we're there to help you with that, or run with it on your own. Up to you as to which option you want to take from there. So just before we close out, as we get close to the top of the hour here, 2 more quick polls that I want to do here. So the first one is just a sense of how you see leveraging what you've seen today. I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. There's a lot of technology here. It got pretty techy, which I don't tend to usually do through my sessions. Is this something that you think you can try out yourself? You like the concept? You need to get others in your organization involved in that? You like some assistance implementing that? Or you just think it's cool and maybe we're not ready for it yet, but it's something I want to park in the back of my mind. So let me leave that open for a bit, let everybody get a chance to respond there. All right. And then there's one more I want to do. It's really about plans for the next webinar. So I've got a couple of topics I can talk about in the March webinar. One is, as I mentioned, go deeper on this topic. So we have some cool features. Let me go show you a little teaser as you're deciding there. Let's bring up our main Envision IT site. Where do we have that? There we go. So I mentioned the idea of being able to navigate through sites. So I also mentioned we create client sites for all of our clients. So I have this A to Z control here that allows us to quickly navigate through sites. So I can click ABC, see all the client sites that are under there. And these are not sub-sites necessarily. I mean, historically they were, but we're moving to creating Office 365 groups for each of these so they don't directly sit underneath this client's site. But because we have that SharePoint list and we have the idea of sites having a parent, we easily wrap that together. And we can do that not just for active clients, we can do it for potential clients, we can do it for partners. We use the same A to Z control on all those different pages. I don't have this live on our site just yet as well. We're working on a SharePoint Framework Extensions component that'll let us build a nice breadcrumb that'll show you where you are in that hierarchy through there. Some of the other interesting things we're looking at is building more web parts to show you who are the members of your group site. So when you're in a particular site, being able to see quickly who you've invited in and allow you to invite additional users easily through there. You can do that out of the box with Office 365 Groups, but there's some challenges depending on the style of sharing that you want to do. Maybe you don't want to share the whole group, you just want to share a portion of the SharePoint site. How do we put some governance around that? So ideas and thoughts around that whole sharing and user experience side of things is really where we're going there. And I just realized I demoed all that stuff while I had the poll open. Apologies on that, so you didn't actually see any of that. Let me just close the poll out here. Which page did I have open here? Yeah, so this is the A to Z control here where I can scroll through the different client sites and such from that point of view. Looks like people are interested in going deeper on the topic, get the external sharing, some of the extensible controls in as part of that. So we come back to the deck here. Where's my screen going? Sorry, I got too many windows going. There we go. So yeah, that's scheduled for March 20th. It's not up on our site just yet. We wanted to get a sense on the topic first, so you'll see that go up before we send the follow-up emails tomorrow. Also, if you're in Washington, D.C. the end of March, I'm going to be doing a full-day workshop on not only this topic, but external sharing, branding, kind of wrapping the whole package together So if you want to get hands-on and really learn deeper from that, you can either come to the workshop itself, which is on Tuesday, March 29th, or I'm delivering breakout sessions Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, which are more lecture style that go through each of those topics as part of that. And then SharePoint Conference North America, we're going to be exhibiting down there May 21st to 23rd in Las Vegas. So if you're in town for that conference, by all means, come by our booth. I'd love to meet in person and chat more about things. So we are at 1:59. Oh, looks like I actually got the timing right. This is a first-time delivery for this talk, so I'm never sure how it's going to go from that point of view. So I want to thank everybody for spending the time with me this afternoon. And by all means, if you've got questions, thoughts, feedback, we'll send out the follow-up emails tomorrow. By all means, reach out and love to hear your comments and thoughts back. Thanks very much and have a great day.